Making a video. Yep. Yeah, I hit the button. Anyway, another lovely day, but it's gonna get cold again. Crud. Um, can't hear everything. So I was just thinking about this general subject of orthodoxy and tradition, and how hard it is to rock any of those kind of boats, and how people just fall into it. And it's almost okay. You could say that it's not it's not malicious. People aren't maliciously um, comfortable, um, accepting what somebody says. I guess that's what it comes down to. And so this is really an issue between me and Holiday. He keeps trying to rub Kant in my face as if I've accepted something Kantian, because I, read the Bible and heard of that golden rule thing, that all of a sudden I'm a Kantian, even though I read the Bible long before I read anything Kant. So obviously the origin of my perspective is not Kantian. And so this gets into the subject of all these people with their name dropping, and who's dropping whose name, and who's making a statement about who said what or what is a certain thing. Sorry, I'm just looking at this camera. I don't know. Yeah, I think it's got some water in it. But anyway, it's just the way it is. A little messy here. So this idea that citing authority is just dangerous, fundamentally. There's a tendency. I mean, I tend to do it too. It really is bothering me. Sorry, I mean, it's not really your problem. But I don't know. Anyway, camera isn't much use as a camera. Kind of thing. Blah blah blah. Yeah, it's back to this whole Newton thing. And I just throw in a little bit of this physics stuff. Just I'm sorry, I will try to stay off the subject, but unless I'm titling a video with the subject. Sorry, this is really very incoherent way to proceed. But it just occurs to me, that they say Newtonian mechanics, and they're really just talking about, okay, well, what if it's like when Newton was talking about what a steel ball does, or a baseball, or something like that. That we're going to apply that to photons and say, okay, because we're saying photons aren't cannonballs. Well, I mean, duh. But more importantly, you have to understand that photons aren't interacting with things like brick walls. That the world they're interacting in is very different. And it really doesn't matter what their discreteness is made out of, like why they are a discrete, simple item. It just seems that you have two choices here in terms of your God theory on physics. You can think things get more complicated as they get smaller, or you can think things get less complicated as they get smaller. And my religion is obviously the it gets simpler, stupid theory, that photons aren't mind readers, that photons aren't carriers of a whole bunch of information, that photons are merely straightforward items, and they are manipulated by environmental circumstances. The environment forces the photons to jump around things and move around things and do things. Everything the photon does, it does because a trampoline, let's say, of some kind, or a force of some kind, forces it to do it. The external world imposes its function because its function is so straightforward. It's mechanically so simple. And intuitively, and I think consistent with much of what we observe in the big world, I think, okay, that this is the more sensible theory to invest in terms of attempting to prove. So what's basically happened here, I'd say, in physics is they have these two, they had two roads they could take. They could take the road that, well, we have a phenomenon that seems very strange, and they chose the more interesting theory rather than the more reasonable theory to invest in proving. So instead of attempting to devaluate or illustrate the preposterousness of the God theory of photons, they decided to go look for evidence that would validate it instead. And that's sort of just what they've got caught up in. And people show up later, like with current Christianity or other religions, and they just accept it because everybody else has accepted it in the past. And so they just work on those premises, those false premises. And there seems to be some credible evidence. They have heard of experiments or supernatural events, or saw a show on TV and there was a ghost in the picture, and a talking horse on TV. TV wouldn't lie to me, right? Well, anyway, you know what I mean. So they've just accepted, and I guess physicists have accepted because it's an orthodoxy. It's the way this is the way we all behave in the Vatican. So they're just putting on their robe and doing their Vatican thing instead of saying, wait a minute, I think they took the wrong fork in the road way back there. And all they're doing is a confirmation bias thing. They're just looking for a way to confirm the wacky theory rather than to rationally start over and say, what are the components here? What do we have as a mechanism? And what logically can we deduce out of this mechanism? Yeah, it's funny. This definitely got water in this camera. Yeah. Shucks. So the water camera with water in it. Yeah, not too good. So it's got some vapor. So anyway, yeah, I'm going to be a bit blurry, I guess. But you can live with that. The content was a bit blurry. It is a bit blurry. Continues to be blurry. Anyway, much easier to cross now that it's been repaired properly by someone. Yeah, it wasn't me. Which is cool. If you wait long enough, somebody else will do it. But they put too many rocks in there. Obviously, next time it rains, it'll all wash out again because they're not allowing for overflow. So, all these physical dynamic things. So yeah, I've made a couple errors in my two slit videos where I've said some things the wrong way that I do have to fix. But I think the overall idea, theme, that we're looking at the wrong place. We're looking at the photon instead of the world the photon is interacting with, and that's just a huge mistake in terms of understanding why. Why there's a certain behavior. It's an environmental creation, not a creation of the thing. Just as when I navigate the world, I largely navigate it, based on its condition, not my condition. It tells me where to go. The path obliges me to do things, and that's how it's working in physics. So again, I did want to get to this idea of the difference between strict mechanics of discrete things, big things, that they're calling Newtonian physics, and this realization that on the small scale, although many principles are the same, obviously things have to change because you're starting to go into the realm of the finite, the realm of the indivisible, divisible, the realm where it's possible to make something too small for a photon to travel through it. These are the realities that you can create. You can create an impediment. You could create a hair so thin that to photons it would be invisible, right? Theoretically, the photon would interact with it. It would have maybe some change in its direction, but it would successfully traverse the hair. So it would never block a photon because it would be too small to do so. And so now we've changed the Newtonian world into a world where, like I said, in this world we can't really create that circumstance. Where some things we can't illustrate the circumstance because we can't create anything with the necessary dynamics, because even a piano wire will cut my head off in this physical world, because we're still made out of matter. We have to understand we're made out of electrons and atoms and photons. Photons, I would argue, completely, but regardless, photons and arrangements, we call these other things, but these other things are what we are made out of. And so our fundamental structure will fall down to that level. And so again, I did point this out in the other video, that when they talk about everything being affected by this quantum, they're just talking about the in a minuscule level, like where the two slit experiment creates bands where my foot would end up being deflected substantially based on relative size. All that's really happening in this quantum world is the shift is so minuscule you couldn't even measure it, just because on the scale of the actual matter, the irregularity or uncertainty is tiny compared to the overall size of the foot. So the effect is still there. It's just imperceptible on this scale of mass. It's 1 in a trillion kind of versus 1 in 2 kind of thing. It's like having a house or something that's as big as the moon versus having a house that's a regular house size. Obviously, the size difference makes a huge difference in terms of how big you seem. So anyway, challenging authorities, especially highly skilled authorities, should come with some sort of, you obviously have to have some sort of, authorities don't really have the responsibility to take on any, homeless guy, shows up with a cardboard hat and says you're wrong. So that's understandable. But I think authorities do have a responsibility to be more accountable than they are to the critiques and criticisms that are provided, are made known, and hopefully I can construct a credible enough criticism to have authorities at least change their rhetoric, at least change the tone of their conversation about what creates the alteration, the changes that take place from Newtonian standards, from Newtonian mechanics. But again, let's understand, Newton understood that photons did not behave like baseballs. But he understood. and he hadn't yet drawn conclusions about what was changing their behavior, whether they were interacting in a pinball machine or rolling down a bowling alley. These are different environmental circumstances. So Newton may have been able to include photons as part of physical mechanics if he could understand the fact that the photon is interacting with matter that is not in a steady state, that is in fact energized, moving, and that change in its state will create irregularities that you'll see in a photon, just as you'll see changes in the steel ball on a pinball machine based on the energy of the bumpers it hits. That kind of logic is, I think, the construction of the quantum that describes quantum mechanics as a description of the reliable elements of that pinball machine. It doesn't quantify everything, but it gives you an indication that there's a pinball machine on the microatomic level, and it has regular patterns, and they can be understood, and they are fundamentally Newtonian. It's just that we don't have enough information to describe the complexity of the world the discrete photons are interacting with. So we just got it wrong. We thought the world they interacted with was fixed and that the photon was variable, when it's the other way around. The photon is a slave to environmental circumstances. Yeah, I think that's enough. I'll do pig. I'll do pig. Yeah. Some days I don't feel much better. Anyway. I've done my job. I think it's a good enough video. This wasn't, it's complex and you gotta be so careful about what you say. Because you can make little errors so easily in getting all these ducks in a row. Keeping all the conceptual and literal plates spinning. But anyway, till next time, and such. Pool looks wonderful, beautiful, pretty.